The wind reached them before the riders did. It swept down from the Sierra Madre in long, restless breaths, carrying with it the smell of mesquite smoke, damp stone, and the faint sweetness of the river that wound past the mission of Nuestra Señora de los Dolores. The mission's adobe walls glowed pale in the late afternoon sun, and beyond them stretched the scattered ranches and presidial outposts that formed the fragile Spanish hold on the northern frontier. Gregoria stood outside her home, her shawl pulled close against the breeze. From where she stood, she could see the mission's bell tower rising above the treetops, a reminder that even here, at the edge of empire, the church and the crown claimed their presence. Behind her, goats bleated from their corral, and the rhythmic clatter of wooden looms drifted from the women working under the shade ramada. A pot of beans simmered over the fire. The day was winding down, but Gregoria's work never did. She paused, listening. Hoofbeats, faint but steady. A patrol returning. Diego had been gone for 3 days riding the rough country between Boca de Leones and the ranches that dotted the plains toward Coahuila. The presidial militia was thinly stretched, and every patrol carried the weight of uncertainty. The riders emerged at last, silhouettes against the reddening sky. Dust clung to their cueras and leather shields. Their horses moved with the weary gait of animals that had covered too many miles in too little time. Diego rode at the front. Even before he reached the corral, Gregoria could see the fatigue in his posture, the stiffness of a man who had slept in the saddle, the dust caked into the lines of his face. But when his eyes found hers, something softened. "You're home," she said quietly. "For now," he answered. He dismounted slowly, wincing as his boots hit the ground. Gregoria stepped forward, taking the reins from his hands. The horse nudged her shoulder, recognizing her touch. Behind them, other soldiers dismounted, some limping, some silent, all carrying the weight of the frontier on their backs. Gregoria moved among them with practiced calm, directing the younger women to fetch water, tending to a scraped arm here, a torn boot there. These men were not strangers. They were part of the fragile community that held this land together. They were her family. A young soldier approached her, barely more than a boy. His adarga was cracked along one edge. "Señora," he said. The Tobosos were near the river again. Gregoria nodded, her expression steady. "You're safe now. Go inside. We'll see to your shield tomorrow." The boy bowed his head and limped toward the mission compound. Diego watched her, admiration hidden beneath exhaustion. "You were not born for this life," he murmured. Gregoria turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight beginning to glow from the hearth. "No," she said, "but this life was born for us." On the northern frontier of New Spain, defense depended on a network of presidios, fortified military posts that guarded missions, ranching settlements, and travel routes. A presidial garrison was a broad institution. It included not only the soldados de cuera, elite mounted troops whose distinctive leather armor gave them their name, but also militia auxiliaries, Indian scouts, carpenters, armorers, blacksmiths, and civilian volunteers who performed military duties when needed. Officers such as sargentos, alfereces, and cabos oversaw patrols, supply lines, and the daily operations of the fort. In short, the presidio was the entire military community. The soldado de cuera, by contrast, was a specific type of frontier cavalryman. He wore a multi-layered leather coat, the cuera, designed to stop arrows, and he fought from horseback with a lance, shield, and musket. These soldiers were professionally trained, paid by the crown, and expected to ride long distances across hostile terrain. They formed the core striking force of the presidial system and were the troops most often associated with the defense of the northern frontier. The distinction is simple but important. Every soldado de cuera served in a presidial garrison. But not everyone in a presidial garrison was a soldado de cuera. The soldado de cuera was the most distinctive cavalryman on the northern frontier of New Spain. His equipment blended medieval armor, indigenous technology, and early modern firearms, a hybrid toolkit shaped by the realities of fighting in vast, open country against fast-moving raiding parties. Every item he carried served a purpose, and together they formed the unmistakable silhouette of the frontier soldier. He wears a heavy, sleeveless coat made of 7 to 10 layers of cured deerskin or antelope hide. It is thick enough to stop a chichimeca arrow, but flexible enough for long days in the saddle. It is often a pale, dusty tan, stained by sweat and the red earth of the north. Flexible yet remarkably strong, it could stop arrows at close range, the primary threat on the frontier. The cuera was hot, heavy, and cumbersome. It weighed over 30 pounds, but it saved lives. Worn over a short blue jacket with red cuffs and collar, it became the visual symbol of Spanish authority in the borderlands. On his arm, he carries a heart-shaped, sometimes round, double-hide shield, adarga. It was light enough for horseback use yet tough enough to deflect arrows and lances. It was an inheritance from Moorish cavalry traditions. Many adargas bore painted designs or the name of the presidio, giving each soldier a sense of identity and pride. It could also bear his family crest or a Spanish lion. The lance was the soldado da cuera's primary offensive weapon. Long, sturdy, and ideal for mounted combat, it allowed the soldier to strike from a distance while maintaining control of his horse. In the open plains of Texas, Coahuila, and Nuevo Leon, the lance was often more effective than firearms. A heavy, single-edged sword, the espada ancha, was the frontier equivalent of a cavalry saber. It was used for close combat, clearing brush, and even butchering livestock. Soldiers often customized their blades, and many passed them down through generations. Each cuera soldier carried a carbine, a short-barreled firearm suited for horseback use, and one or two flintlock pistols. These weapons were slow to reload and unreliable in wet weather, but they provided crucial firepower during ambushes or defensive stands. Powder and shot were issued by the crown and inspected weekly. A soldado de cuera was required to maintain 6 horses, 1 colt, and 1 mule. This allowed him to ride for days without exhausting his mounts. His saddle was high-backed and reinforced, designed for stability during combat. Saddlebags carried essentials: powder, shot, rations, a whetstone, spare flints, and sometimes a rosary or small devotional image. Beneath the cuera, the soldier wore a short blue coat with red facings, blue breeches, a wool cape for cold nights, leather leggings for protection against thorns, and a wide-brimmed hat or leather helmet. Personal items varied, but most carried a small knife, a tinderbox, and religious medals or charms. Taken together, the equipment of the soldado da cuera formed a complete frontier fighting system. One designed not for European battlefields but for the unique challenges of the northern provinces. These soldiers were mobile, resilient, and capable of surviving in harsh terrain for weeks at a time. Their gear reflected centuries of adaptation and the lived experience of men who defended the edge of empire. A cuera soldier's life is extremely dangerous. A cuera sergeant's wife's life was terrifying. She lived in a world where soldados de cuera were not just acquaintances. They were her family, her husband's subordinates, and her primary protectors. Because of her family status and her husband's rank, she was also looked up to as a leader of the military families when the men were gone. Military households were the backbone of early settlements, and wives like Gregoria carried responsibilities that extended far beyond the domestic sphere. They managed property and livestock during their husbands' absences, maintained kinship alliances, and anchored the social stability of communities that lived under constant threat from distance, isolation, and conflict. As a woman looked up to by others, she would have managed the presidio families, negotiated with Tlaxcalan allies, protected her children during raids, and lived with the knowledge that every patrol could be the last. Her home would be a rallying point for the cueras and their families before departures, and when patrols returned. Her courtyard would be full of drying leather jackets and the adargas, left there by the men as they went to their homes. The night began like any other, the wind whispering through the huasach trees and the mission bell settling into silence. Gregoria had just finished mending a tear in Diego's blue jacket when she heard it. A distant thud, like a fist striking earth. Then another. And another. Not hoofbeats. Not thunder. Something else. Dogs bristled. A baby cried. Shadows moved between the mesquite. Too many, too fast to be deer. Raiders. Dona Isabel grabbed her arm. They're coming from the river. The men are still out on patrol. Gregoria's heart hammered. Diego had left 2 days earlier with 12 cuera soldiers. He may be miles away, too far to help. The mission bell rang once, a warning, not a prayer. Women rushed to gather children. Tlaxcalan families moved with practiced calm, herding people toward the stone chapel. Gregoria forced herself to breathe. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. A woman of the frontier does not wait for rescue. She becomes it. She ran to the courtyard where the cuirass hung drying on wooden racks. The leather coats swayed like empty skins in the moonlight. She grabbed one, far too large for her, and dragged it toward the chapel. Arrows hissed through the air. One struck the corral post beside her. Another thudded into the adobe roof. A third skittered across the ground at her feet. Shouts erupted from the darkness. The Tobosos, fierce and fast, their war cries slicing through the night. Gregoria shoved the children inside the chapel and slammed the heavy wooden door. Women braced it with benches. The priest clutched a lantern, his hands trembling. "Where are the soldiers?" he whispered. "On patrol," Gregoria said. "We hold until they return." A crash shook the door. The hinges groaned. A woman screamed. Gregoria seized a fallen adarga and planted herself beside the door. Her hands shook, but she held the shield steady. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, faint at first, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Real ones. Fast. Many. The sound grew louder, rolling across the plain like a storm. The door burst open. Not from raiders, but from the force of a familiar voice shouting. "Atroz, atroz." Diego. He rode into the courtyard with his men, their cuirass gleaming in the torchlight, lances lowered. The raiders scattered, melting into the darkness as quickly as they had come. Diego dismounted before the dust settled. His eyes found Gregoria, standing with the adarga still in her hands, hair loose, breath ragged. "Were you hurt?" he asked, voice tight. "No," she said, "but they were close." He touched her cheek, his hand trembling. "You stood your ground." "I had to." He looked at her, really looked, and something changed in his expression. "Respect. Oh, recognition. You are not the girl from Mexico City anymore," he said softly. Gregoria exhaled, the fear finally leaving her body. "No," she said. "I am a woman of the North." In that moment, Diego saw her not as the sheltered daughter of a licenciado, but as the woman the frontier had forged. A woman who could hold a community together with nothing but courage and a borrowed shield. Gregoria felt it too. Something inside her had shifted. The fear that once lived in her chest had hardened into resolve. The frontier had tested her, and she had not broken. Later that night, after the raiders fled and the mission bell rang in gratitude, Gregoria stepped outside the chapel. The wind swept across the valley, carrying the smell of mesquite and dust. Above her, the stars burned bright over the Boca de Leones, the mouth of a lion. She lifted her face to the wind, the adarga still warm in her hands. She had come from the city of palaces. But here, on this raw and restless frontier, she had become what her father once told her she was. A Longoria, an Urdinola, iron, and the land would remember her. Gregoria Suarez de Longoria would never again be only the child of Mexico City's palaces or the granddaughter of a governor. She had become something rarer, a matriarch of the northern frontier, a woman whose endurance would shape generations. The archival record preserves no letters in her hand, no diary entries, no confessions of fear or triumph. But her life is written in the lineage that followed. In the Jimenez soldiers who patrolled the plains, in the Longoria descendants who settled the villas del Norte, in the families who carried her blood into Coahuila, Nuevo Leon, Tamaulipas, and eventually the Texas plains. Her legacy is not found in ink. It is found in survival and family.